Government's using new special powers to comb through your bank accounts, look at where you've been spending your money. Well, every transaction that you make will now be monitored by the government. That appears to be the case.
The Supreme Court has just ruled that the IRS is now allowed to secretly go into your bank records and take bank records to see where you are spending money.
It's exactly what the British government is trying to do, giving itself sweeping powers to secretly monitor your bank accounts.
The government has essentially snuck in these sweeping powers into a really unrelated bill on data, whereby they will be able to force banks to continuously and repeatedly search bank accounts for what they call indicators of potential fraud and error. So there's not even a crime threshold, there's no suspicion threshold. It's partly administrative because they're looking for errors in the administration of welfare and benefits, including the state's own errors. In fact, it won't even stop at banks because this extraordinary financial snoopers charter is aimed at third-party organizations. So initially it's going to be banks and building societies, but the people that I've spoken to in the government in formal meetings have said that they're interested in extending this to places like online marketplaces, eBay, and so on.
President Obama has acknowledged the existence of a pair of highly classified surveillance programs to combat terrorism. The National Security Agency and FBI have been amassing a vast trove of communications data that was, until just recently, undisclosed to the public. One part is the phone call records of millions of Americans. A second is codenamed PRISM and involves the collection of communications via some of the largest tech companies in the U.S. How does PRISM work? The point of the $20 million program is to find the proverbial needle in the haystack using advanced data mapping technologies. As the former chief counsel to the House Intelligence Committee described it to the Wall Street Journal, the PRISM database is the haystack. The program, according to a document leaked to the Washington Post and The Guardian, taps into the central servers of Apple, YouTube, Skype, Facebook, Google, AOL, Paltalk, Yahoo, and Microsoft. All these companies deny granting the government direct backdoor access to their servers. The Obama administration says the program only targets foreigners. People outside the U.S. are some of the heaviest users of these company services. How does the government get access to this data? Agency officials must ask the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court to issue orders to the companies requiring them to share their data. The court was established in the late 1970s to guard against surveillance abuses. It has 11 U.S. District Court judges selected by the Chief Justice of the United States who serve staggering terms of up to 7 years. A single judge reviews a warrant application. Are these requests on the rise? Yes, in 2008 there were fewer than 25, but applications to the court have exploded in recent years with over 200 last year.
So that essentially any online account that you have could be within the crosshairs of financial state-backed surveillance.
And of course, we all have online bank accounts. There are very few of us operating like the Flintstones these days. So we all have to rely digitally now on banks. We're closing down branches so that everything is moving towards no tellers and everything is moving digitally. So almost everything then would be caught up in this net. Am I wrong?
It could be, and that's really one of the extraordinary things about these enormous powers is that they so lack limitation. And in an increasingly digital world, we have to think about what that means. I mean, already it's not just banks, as you say. We've also got the likes of PayPal, other digital payment platforms that people use. We're also seeing a march towards CBDCs, and governments around the world are trying to give the public assurance by saying, it's just conspiracy theorists who think CBDC is going to be used to spy on people and control what you spend. We would never do on that. Well,
the third way we think CBDC can improve financial inclusion is through what we call programmability. That is, CBDC can allow government agencies and private sector players to program, to create smart contracts, to allow targeted policy functions. For example, welfare payment. For example, consumption coupon. For example, food stamp. By programming CBDC, those money can be precisely targeted for what kind of people can own and what kind of use this money can be utilized.
You look at what's happening now with traditional banking, and even with traditional banking, these powers are going to be used to put people under constant monitoring. And the thing about these powers is, of course, it affects the people that can be kind of othered, if you like. So people think it doesn't affect me. It's just people who are in receipt of welfare and benefits. Well, in the UK, that's all of us at some point, because that includes pension. And all of us will become pensioners at some point. If you fall ill, then you'll need to have some kind of sickness payment. So actually it affects a huge amount of the population, and it will expand. Of course, once you have the government inside people's bank accounts, having this kind of backdoor ability to look at what people are spending, I think it's a matter of time before that extends to tax collection and other kind of automated policy enforcement. And that also mirrors, I have to say, what we see in some of the conversation about CBDCs around the world, that governments are already looking at how you can automate welfare and welfare payments and tax collection.
The whole idea, of course, they're spinning this is it's more convenient for you, right? CBDCs, all of this, it's about convenience to improve your life. But of course, really, it's about control and it's about surveillance. The UK, of course, already has a massive surveillance program. I don't think you could walk down any corner in London and not be videoed and photographed in some capacity. So this is just an extension of that. And you pointed out something really interesting I wanted to go back to, which is the idea of where this threshold is, this fraud threshold or whatever it is they're going to be monitoring. So it sounds kind of nebulous, like there's really no specificity to exactly what would be flagged. And they would say, this guy's a terrorist. We need to watch this guy.
What exactly can the government do to any of us, whether we're on the watch list or not? Michael German is a former FBI agent who has experience with the terrorism watch list.
What is the internal designation given to people who are on that watch list?
Known or suspected terrorist.
Do you need to be a known or suspected terrorist to be given that designation?
No, you do not. There's plenty of evidence that people who were put on these lists were investigated for no reasons. So you're building this expanding pool of suspects based on little or no real evidence.
What are the most extreme things that can happen to you if you end up in that system?
There's so little transparency that we don't know all the ways that the watch lists might be used. So from a deprivation of rights standpoint, there's a lot you could lose.
You're absolutely right that Britain is already a surveillance society, quite unlike, even far beyond other countries around the world. Now we've got this leap into financial surveillance. And I should add as well, as you'll know, in Europe, there are strict cash spending controls now as well.
Yes.
Like you're not supposed to do cash transactions in many European countries over 500 euros, which is about, $750 or something. They're really quite tight controls. But yes, you're right. I mean, of course, you have to tackle fraud in society, and nobody wants public money to be spent fraudulently. The government already has powers to obtain the bank statements of suspects. And in fact, when you're doing a welfare application, you have to give a huge amount of information, IDs, bank statements, pay slips, a huge amount of information. And that can be then requested again on demand. This is different. This is specifically without suspicion. The government says we're introducing these powers to look at people where there is no suspicion.
After weeks of protests, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is taking drastic action to put an end to the Freedom Convoy protests.
The time to go home is now.
Trudeau invoking emergency powers, allowing the government to remove cars and trucks, suspend their insurance, and even freeze truckers' personal and corporate bank accounts.
It is the financial provisions of this Emergencies Act that are particularly concerning to many. The federal government is saying banks have already started to freeze the accounts of people involved in the protests, and they are warning there will be dire financial consequences to come.
We know that financial institutions are already moving to restrict access to both cash and cryptocurrency. That's another big thing here that we're watching as well. So the RCMP have been sharing information with these financial institutions on the protesters, their supporters, the organizers, measures here, trying to sort of starve off or choke off access to money, which of course has now been funding this for some 3 weeks. And the government has cited terrorist fundraising laws, now directing financial institutions to target people who have perhaps donated. You were talking about that with David as well, that it's a little murky here, exactly how this is going to be applied to some people. Chrystia Freeland yesterday not saying how many accounts have been frozen, not saying whose accounts have been frozen, but certainly the threat is there looming for people who have been involved with all of this.
That should be where the alarm bell is ringing for everybody, because what undermines what underpins a free society is the presumption of innocence. And when you lose that, we become a world of suspects where all of our data has to be looked at all the time, just in case we do something wrong. That is not a free world, but that's the world that's being built around us.
It's terrifying, right? There's no suspicion at all, but we're just going to monitor you in case it's whether it's thought crime. And this is what bothers me, right? It's, you've got a subscription, you've got an online subscription to, our show, like our show gets flagged as dangerous, and so, you're a subscriber to Redacted, or you're a subscriber to a particular newspaper or a Substack of a journalist, and we don't like that. That's thought crime. We have a problem with that, so we want to look more deeply into this individual, right? This is where this goes.
If your truck is being used in these protests, your corporate accounts will be frozen. The insurance on your vehicle will be suspended. The consequences are real, and they will bite. It is time for you to go home. And let me also be clear that we will have zero tolerance for the establishment of new blockades or occupations.
I'm not one of those people that can sit back and say we should just trust the government. They've never done anything wrong. They have a long track record of doing these things.
Absolutely. To say trust the government, they only want these powers for purely benevolent reasons, is its own conspiracy theory, because it's not borne out by any fact, or the path of history shows us that power has to be limited and it has to be scrutinized. And that's what we're saying here. We cannot hand over mass, suspicionless bank, building society, endless financial surveillance powers to a government and still call ourselves a free country. You're absolutely right that there is a risk for these powers to be politicized. We saw during the pandemic, the way that financial surveillance powers were used, whether it was PayPal or the Canadian banks deciding to freeze and close the accounts of people that were protesting the government, many of whom I think were vindicated in the actions that they took. The argument becomes this: once the government has the back door and has the powers, they say, well, it would be wrong if we didn't also use it for this other purpose that benefits society. And it almost becomes then, they will frame it as an obligation that they have to do more surveillance and more enforcement. So, the argument really should begin and end when the government wants to get into your bank account without suspecting you of having done anything wrong. It's as simple as that.